Cool. I guess we're live. This is a first for the YouTube channel ever. And basically, what myself and Adam are going to do is go through any kind of questions that come up on the comments. Likely, there's not going to be a ton for these first few, but we did have some on Instagram that we have kind of prepared. So it should be a relatively smooth process to start up. But the moral of the story is if you guys have any questions related to PEDs, bodybuilding, dietary necessities, training, what have you, we're looking to help answer any of those that we absolutely can. So by all means, Adam, if you could, you have some questions already laid out. Maybe you could start with one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to combine this one sort of into one question. This is from Ike on Instagram. So he says, what is the best diet advice to get a six-pack? How can I get cut? So I can start off with this, Kolton. Maybe you can jump in.
Yeah.
So I'll just go over the basics, which most viewers are probably familiar with. Is one, you want a caloric deficit. So you want to be eating less than your maintenance calories, and you want to ensure this caloric deficit by your diet, as well as through your expenditure, whether it be cardio or step count. So find your maintenance calories, eat at a caloric deficit. You can go anywhere from 300 to 500 calories as an initial deficit. And then as you lose weight, you can adjust this deficit over time. So that's from the nutritional and expenditure standpoint. Now, I know most people like to talk from the PD side of things. This is when you can sort of use lipolytic agents like T3, T4, clenbuterol, growth hormone. But usually you want to induce the caloric deficit without using these lipolytic agents first, and then introduce them when you need them. Now, something like growth hormone, you might have be running year round, and you can just simply switch to an AM dose, pre-fasted cardio. But things like your Himban, Ephedrine, your T3, your T4s, your clenbuterol, these are things you can also introduce fasted cardio to increase the bioavailability, effectiveness on them, and them to use stored glycogen to basically help you burn more fat and have a more effective lipolysis process. So that's from the PD side of things. But really, before you get into the PD side of things, the caloric deficit is going to be most important. Nutrition is going to be top of that pyramid. So if you don't have your nutrition on point, you're not in a caloric deficit, don't even worry about the PED side of things. Focus on your diet. In fact, I would say diet is even more important than your expenditure in cardio, when you can get lean by just focusing on diets and being in a caloric deficit than doing shit tons of cardio.
Yeah. So just to clarify his question, he was basically asking, like, how can you get a six-pack, like the fastest?
How can you get a six-pack? How can you get cut? How can you get lean?
Okay. Yeah, and everything you said is basically the truth. It's funny because I was actually just having a discussion with someone today about this, and it was them kind of addressing, like, they were losing weight really fast in a really progressive fashion. And they're like, so when can I use like a GLP-1 agonist? It's like, well, like that's, miles ahead of like where we are. So like the simple answer to getting abs is like restrict your calories and move more in general. And just doing that alone, as we are energetic humans, you will see an improvement in body composition, provided you're eating enough protein, you're training enough, if you are using the drugs, using the appropriate drugs, and just literally going through the motions. There's nuance, and it depends on the advancement of someone's career, I would say. Like if you have someone who is a higher level competitor or who has been bodybuilding for a while and has a substantial amount of contractile tissue, then you need to talk about like calorie cycling and carbohydrate manipulation. You need to talk about potentially using things like deloads in a cut and any kind of possible way to conserve tissue, moderation of cardio and the excess of cardio to generate excess fatigue. So there's a lot of different questions that I would have contextually for a person who says, well, I want to get a six-pack. But assuming if it's just a guy who wants to get ripped, it is as simple as eat more protein and move a little bit more. And you'd be shocked to see, like, I guess I have some pretty basic rules, right? If people want to generally lose weight, whether they're on vacation, whether they're just living life, whatever, simply eat more protein, just like what I say, meat and produce, avoid, beverages that have calories, and simply move more. Like if you can walk, and you can attest to this just as well as I can, if you can walk 12 to 20,000 steps a day, you will lose adipose tissue faster than you ever have. train good, don't drink calories, eat meat and produce, and you are going to make progress. And it's brainless almost.
No, absolutely. And as you sort of said, it depends on where the advancement and also what type of leanness we're going for. Here we just said 6-pack, so we're not assuming stage ready. One thing I will add, which I've actually seen with a bunch of clients, and this is not true for individuals, and it's quite situational. If, for instance, a client has not the largest abdominal muscles, sometimes it can actually be good to hypertrophy the abdominals and cause a bit of growth so that when you do get leaner body fat, that they actually are a bit more visible. Now, I'm not saying do ab work to get abs. I'm simply saying that with a couple of clients that I've actually seen, they don't have the largest or strongest abdominal muscles. So we had to get very, very, very lean to actually see their abdominals, where in growth phases post their deficits, we've actually included some direct ab work, hypertrophied their abdominals. So next time we got lean, we didn't have to get as lean to have visible abs. Now, this is not true for all people, and for most advanced trainees, they will have sufficient abdominal muscles. That's just a question of body fat. But sometimes if you're a beginner lifter, so to speak, it actually is worthwhile to do direct ab work to build up that baseline of tissue on your abs. So when you actually get lean, you don't have to get like super lean to actually have visible abdominals. Where, like, for instance, myself, I have like pretty hypertrophy abdominals. I can get like 13%, 14% body fat, and I'll start getting visible abs just because I used to do a shitload of abs back in my less informative years and have built that layer of tissue.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, especially, and you see this a lot on bodybuilding stages, is like dudes will be shredded. We talked about this before, or close to it, and not have any ab definition. And I think training a lot of, and this is something we have in both of our programs, I've noticed, is a lot of like lower abdominal work to develop that. And like you said, hypertrophy those lower abs, because truth be told, if you're not previously an athlete or you haven't done any sort of strenuous work that requires a lot of core work in a sense, you're not going to have that development, which would lead to a very well-defined abdominal wall if you aren't hyper lean. Like, everyone's going to have abs, period. But if you're like, I have abs too, and I'm certainly not like 8% body fat. And that's because they are hypertrophied to a point where they protrude past a certain point. So yeah. We have a lot of good questions come in, and I want to make sure we can get to these. So I'll ask one of these, and then we'll move back to your Instagram questions if that's cool with you. So Michael asks, how to avoid water retention and elevated heart rate on GH? I'll let you go first.
Okay. So when it comes to water retention, there's many factors that can affect it. Okay. Firstly, I would argue that your GH should not be causing severe water retention. So I don't know how much GH you're running. So let's pretend you're running, 10 IUs or more, okay? And somehow you have a lot of water retention. I would argue if it's real GH, especially if it's pharma GH, there shouldn't be significant water retention that's causing issues. Yes, when you start using the growth hormone, there might be a little bit of issues. So let's bypass that and just say you have water retention. Maybe it's from the GH, maybe it's from something else. Firstly, one thing I would do is not necessarily cut your water intake. I would firstly assume that you have good electrolyte balance. So ensure that you're getting adequate levels of sodium, magnesium, potassium, either from your diet or supplementation, or a combination of both is what I usually recommend. So make sure your diet is rich in potassium-rich foods. Think your spinach, think your potassium. We like to use chronometer so we can actually check our micronutrient levels, and this is a good way of tracking it. Also, I would salt your food. And if you want to be really precise, I would measure out your salt for the day and then individually sprinkle on your meal. So if you want to be really controlled with your sodium intake, and then I actually would not cut water. Okay. Your body wants to achieve homeostasis. So as soon as you start dehydrating yourself, you're actually likely to retain more water. So in this case, I would assume, look, there's different water recommendations for each individual. So now I might have to convert here for liters. I ideally drink about 8 liters a day, sometimes probably higher now that I'm in Thailand, trying to get close to 10 liters, ensuring my urine is clear. For yourself, that might translate to, 2 gallons, which I think was roughly 6 to 8 liters, depending on how large you are and depending what variant you are. So basically, to summarize, I would stay hydrated, check your electrolyte levels, check what you're eating also in your diet. Are you not controlling sodium, eating a shitload of high sodium food and not hydrating yourself adequately? Are you eating a shitload of inflammatory food, which maybe doesn't sit well with your digestion? So I would be hard to believe that you have significant water retention on growth hormone. Let's say you just have water retention. So I would look into what is actually causing retention. If it's your growth hormone, then potentially check, is it real growth hormone? Because there shouldn't be crazy water retention on, maybe just a little bit when you use it. Kolton, anything you want to add to that? I can keep going.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and that's kind of the issue with it being a bodybuilder and using compounds is it's very multifactorial. Like, I suggest maybe dropping down what you're currently running on top of that, but generally speaking, your aldosterone will be manipulated by growth hormone in some capacity, but it's not going to be nearly as much as it would be by androgens or even potentially estrogen. So I usually like to ask, where is the water retention? Is it like localized to the fingers and hands? Because that's very common. Is it in your ankles and feet? Because that's very common. And that's usually not due to specifically growth hormone. It can potentiate it a little bit more, but that's also partly just you're not probably moving efficiently. Like your lymphatic system is swelling up in these areas because you're not providing it gravity to move that fluid around. And that's kind of one of the bigger things. I think another thing is critical, and you mentioned it briefly too, is magnesium, calcium, potassium. So like your mineral intake is something that goes way overlooked by many bodybuilders. And simply taking very large doses of magnesium, don't take magnesium citrate in large doses because it's just going to cause diarrhea. But taking a large lump sum of magnesium trionates, glycinates, bisglycinate, and doing that periodically throughout the day can be very beneficial. Something like 200 milligrams with each meal or 500 milligrams to 400 in the morning and nights, very beneficial for something like that. Making sure you're getting 1,000-ish milligrams of calcium. These things will ensure you have like a homeostatic tendency for your water retention. And then the other thing is that like most often when I see, even with androgens, when I see that someone starts to retain a lot of water, there's like this adaptive curve where it's almost, we disrupted homeostasis. And so the body's stressed and it's like water, like glucocorticoid system lights on fire. And then shortly after, in maybe a couple weeks of time, it just kind of falls off. So I think there's like an adaptive period from when you either start a compound or titrate the dose up that you might see some manipulation in body water that could lead to those issues. The other thing, and I could talk about this forever as well, the other thing is like your retention of glycogen, lipids, and nitrogen change when you use growth hormone. So let's say you're an individual that needs a very high carbohydrate diet. Well, you might not be just holding water, but you're holding more glycogen, and osmolytes, as they are, which is glycogen, it pulls water into your system. So you wouldn't be holding water, but maybe intracellular fluid, which would make you appear fuller and maybe feel a lot more like congested as a human being. But ultimately, you're getting the effect that you're trying to target from growth hormone, which is that nitrogen, glycogen retention that is so feel good and awesome about it. So I wouldn't get super, okay, he mentions it's in the hands. So like for me, again, that's like, I get that a lot, right? And like my rings fit, sometimes they don't. Like right now, this one, like I can't take it off for the life of me, right? So like it shifts, it wanes. And I think that's really just due to the lymphatic system. Like when I sit here and work all day, my hands are down and that fluid just drains into my hands and it becomes hard to move them around and to get that carpal tunnel feeling. But if I'm moving around, if I'm having an active day, if my steps are high, usually that goes away. But in the hands, it's kind of a tricky one because once you get androgens high enough, once you get anything relatively high enough, that's going to happen most typically.
I was going to add, if it is in the hands, then yes, with growth hormone, there's not too much you can do because I wouldn't advise taking a diuretic or anything to counteract that. That's not something you want to be messing with on a frequent or daily basis. When it comes to hands, like I said, movement, like you said, and trying to basically stay active and basically not be in a static position, which can basically cause that. If you wake up when you sleep after you're sleeping and you find that your hands are swelling a bit, maybe some light activity to get going might help with that.
Yeah, and if you're taking your like typical telmisartan or some other ARB, and you're already doing everything you need to, it's just some part of this is the cost of doing business with growth hormone, and that's one of the reasons some people can't stick with it. So Yeah, that was a great question. What do you have from Instagram? You have another one?
This one is quite broad. It's a pretty good one. What's the best drug of life?
To be honest, like, well, if I had to select the one that I would probably run for the rest of my life, there's a lot.
I know it's very easy for me.
Well, I was going to say testosterone, obviously,
Yeah, of course,
much more functional dose than probably what a doctor would recommend. And then I would love if I could just squeeze in Cialis in there, like 5 milligrams a day for the rest of my life. I wouldn't be too upset about that.
Don't get me started, Cialis. I've been going to multiple pharmacies here, and
they don't have it.
No, they do. They either if they have it, they want to charge like almost 80 to 100 USD for like 4 tablets.
What?
Yeah.
That's insanity.
Now, I don't know if I'm getting charged a foreigner price. Yeah, I probably am. But say I even asked, some of the local contacts here, and they were still wanting to charge. I think, well, it was 28 pills, but it was 110 USD.
Wow, that's still really for 20 milligram pills, or?
No, these were for 5 milligram pills. 28 5 milligram pills.
Oh my god, dude.
At that price, that's literally I can just buy more growth hormone.
Yeah, you should have told me. I have like a stockpile. Like I've planned enough to last me for at least the next 3 years. So I should be good.
No, that's all good. I was assuming, that you might have to, when you come over, bring that with you because it seems to be in short supply.
I'll send you a resource after this too that can be helpful for that.
But, thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely testosterone. I mean, like, there's nothing that makes me feel better like a moderate to high dose of testosterone. I feel always good, and as long as estrogen's in line, it's like, fuck, man, it's the best kind of opium you could take, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this was a more philosophical question, but then I would argue that it's happiness, but then you can get a euphoric effect from testosterone. So.
Yeah, it's like just inject your bro. Like,
still answers your question.
That is the solution to all problems. I'm pretty sure. From what I've done, at least as far as the research I've conducted, it seems that depression is just a matter of not taking enough grams of gear. So
100%. That's the solution to all depression.
We got Joe R. How do you prevent ingrown hair on your back during cycle? This is a pretty important question, actually.
Okay, I've got a couple ideas.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so ingrown hairs are an interesting one. Firstly, I would say if you can use some sort of hair removal device. For instance, myself, I actually get that on my legs, right? And what I have found, which really aids me, is using it's like a body groomer where it doesn't cut my hairs like a razor very closely. It's a body groomer which removes the hair. And I found that if I basically have my legs relatively hairless, that prevents the ingrown hairs. Now, if you don't want to shave, which I would say it becomes kind of hard to prevent because some people are just really prone to ingrown hairs. Firstly, when you finish gym, you want to be, get clean as soon as possible, because I found when you are staying for a prolonged period of time with bacteria, sometimes it can cause that. Also, the hair itself, especially when you're training and it's rubbing against like material and clothing, can sometimes cause that irritation, which causes the ingrown hair, which is why I'm like, first solution, shave and use a device which doesn't cause stubble or cause sort of razor burn and things like that. I've used a product, I don't know what it's called in the US, but like a Beat. It's like hair removal cream. I used to use that. I don't advocate for that because it can cause burns and irritation to the skin, so don't do that. Really good body groomer is your first way to go. And then once you've used the body groomer, honestly, just stay on top of it and staying as hygienic as you can post-training. If you're an individual who trains hard, sweats a lot, I know I do. If I don't go shower pretty soon after training, I can get ingrown hairs or bacteria. So it's basically clean skin using a quality, I would say, body wash, so to speak, which again will keep you clean, keep you hygienic, and then potentially look into a body groomer and shaving your hair. That's from the hygiene standpoint. There's also, I guess, an androgen standpoint if potentially you're getting acne, which is causing ingrown hairs. Maybe Kolton, you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said too. And I think that's really important. Is I love talking about cleanliness because I just have like this image of what a bodybuilder is in my head. And it's like a mouth breathing, like sweat ball of like high blood pressure and hypertension, just fucking walking around. And it's super duper important to be continuously washing yourself, making sure you're scrubbing your back. Like, get one of those back scrubbers, bro, and just like fucking scrub shit back there. Exfoliate. Like, men don't exfoliate enough, and it's super duper important. But on top of as far as pharmacology, there is like ketoconazole shampoo, which could hypothetically help. And this is something that you might see on Reddit forums and such. There's obviously not really great clinical research to support this, but in theory, its mechanism should support localized or inhibit localized development of those DHT-driven glands to produce more sebum and then cause that issue in general. But usually what you're looking at is, as a bodybuilder, those sebaceous glands being activated by androgens are secreting more of cholesterol, lipids, and bacteria that's causing localized infections in the like little gland that your hair is trying to come out of. And that's what's causing that irritation and swelling. And so typically what my recommendation is, first line of defense is, and this is a long discussion, but ameliorate your gut health, like fix that. Because your immune system is dictated entirely off of the gut and its function. If that is, if you're running herbal protocols and whatever, maybe go nuclear and try an antibiotic like doxycycline for several weeks and see if that manifests in less ingrown hairs. And then if that still doesn't see you improving, I would say, again, the like anatomical or the atomic bomb of nuclear options would be Accutane at a higher dose for a short period of time. If it's acne driven, right? If it's not, I would first line hygiene all day.
So if I can add to that, interesting you brought up the Accutane. Basically isotretinoin, or Roaccutane is another name for it. So I have a bit of experience with this one for myself and clients, and I actually do recommend it. Almost do recommend it for most bodybuilders, but it's actually circumstantial when I say this. Okay, firstly, you want to, obviously, assuming you're getting constant blood work and you're checking that your liver health is good, use TGT, AST, ALT, all the different liver markers. But I've found that using a full dose of Accutane, if you have severe acne, can be a good course to initially do. So I think the general recommended dosage is about, do it on a 1-to-1 ratio between your weight and the dosage. So for me, if I was around 100 kilograms, I'd take 100 milligrams. So I think it's about per 10 kilograms, 10 milligrams. This will have to be prescribed by a dermatologist. You can get it through other means, but usually you want to go through a dermatologist if you can. But typically what I've seen with many clients who have acne issues, especially when they're using androgens, is run a full course of Roaccutane. You will likely have to run TRT because of all the things that have elevated my liver enzymes. Accutane is elevated more than any sort of oral anabolic, surprisingly. So when you are using it, you want to look after your liver health. So don't be taking Accutane with trend, with drinking, with recreational drugs, with everything else. Just enjoy some TRT for some time. Then once you finish the course of Accutane, you can drop down to a maintenance dose. And this can be individual, where with myself, I started with a maintenance dose of 20 milligrams every day. And I titrated it down basically to 20 milligrams twice a week or 3 times a week. And I found that, you spoke about the glands and androgens releasing cholesterol or lipids and so forth. I found that basically Accutane reduced the secretion, which reduced my levels of acne and ingrown hairs just on this maintenance dose. Now, I've been on this maintenance dose for like 4 or 5 years, constantly get blood work, and my ALT and AST and liver, kidney and liver markers almost always in range. And if they are elevated, it's usually from training or the brief time, I've used a bit of oral anabolics. But for the most part, I do recommend it if you can do it, intelligently and safely. But it's a really good way of managing acne, especially if you're prone to acne on cycle. Because most individuals get really bad acne, and then they say, "Oh shit, what do I have to do?" Maybe they get some acne scarring, and then they only jump on the Accutane. So maybe be a bit proactive about it before if your acne is, even moderate, because you can even potentially just use a maintenance dose without doing a full course of Accutane first.
Yeah, I like that. And that's something, I'll be honest, when me and Adam linked up in Thailand and like we're working together with our coaching company and whatnot, but I've been always against low dose use of Accutane just because of its hepatotoxic effects. And what I typically do is run Accutane at very high doses, so exceeding that 1 milligram per kilogram dose for a short period of time, something like 12 weeks, and sort of cycle it to get an epigenetic shift. And then hopefully we ameliorate all acne furthermore, and those sebaceous glands kind of shrink up. But that idea of a maintenance dose is pretty cool, and such an infrequent dose, like 1, 2 to maybe 3 times a week of a low dose, which usually Accutane, if you're getting pharmaceutical grade at least, comes in 20 milligram like capsules. Then looking at Adam's blood work, I see absolutely no degradation to his hepatic system or any functional component of his health. So I think it is a good solution as well. And you know what, like honestly, if out of all the unattractive things that we do as bodybuilders, I think having a shit ton of ingrown hairs, which is probably just cystic acne, is probably the last thing you want to add to the compilation of things that we're unattractive for. So using a little bit of Accutane would probably be long-term beneficial for your psychological health and many other things. But I think that's overall really comprehensive.
I'd like to add one caveat. If you are a female and you want to run Reaccutane or Accutane, do not be pregnant, do not get pregnant. You will probably get told this when you use this, but that can have, negative impacts on your potential child. So just keep that in mind.
Right. And with that too, it's as Adam said, 1 milligram per kilogram dose. So if you're no more than 40 some kilograms and you're female, then you don't need to take much at all. So
yes.
All right. So prostate health, sleep has been affected by frequent bathroom breaks. There's a lot to say here. Adam, I'm actually curious what you have to say. There's a couple of
prostate health protocol. See, firstly, it depends. What are you currently running? What is actually affecting your prostate? Have you checked with your prostate's enlarged? Are you running a shitload of DHT derivatives? Sometimes I find with I can get a side effect from DHT derivatives, particularly menstruant. Sometimes it can cause a bit of inflammation or swelling of the prostate, which can result in more frequent bathroom breaks. But then I would say, again, you can look into certain prostate medication if required, but usually you want to address what the cause is. So are you getting a high amount, you're using a high amount of DHT derivatives that's giving this, God forbid, or do you have prostate, cancer or any tumors along those lines? So I say if it is something serious that is either causing you very frequent bathroom breaks, go get it checked first. Okay, go ensure that you don't have any sort of tumor or prostate cancer first. That is like the overall most important thing to check first. And once you clear then we can sort of go down the list of things which can cause enlarged prostates. And one of the things, if you're running androgens, is use of DHT derivatives, which one of the side effects can be enlarged or inflamed prostate. So I would start to look into that. Then I would look at potentially any sort of, diet or other medications which can cause inflamed prostates. When you say sleep has been affected by bathroom breaks, are you sure it's necessarily prostate related? Because it can also be your water intake prior to going to bed. Are you consuming large amounts of water before you go to bed, which is causing you to wake up frequently? I know this was an issue with myself where I need to cut water intake before bed. So I would say first look at what the issue is. Like, are you getting frequent bathroom breaks during the day? Because that might also more be prostate. Because if you are getting frequent bathroom breaks only in the evening, it might not be a prostate. It might just be your water consumption prior to going to bed, which is causing it. So we need a little bit of information there, but I'm going to assume that if it is prostate, you want to get those markers checked first.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different remedies to this. And honestly, coming from like a function, I work with a lot of females, right? And Adam doesn't necessarily love to work with those kind of clients because they're, lack of better terms, annoying. But a lot of what they have to deal with is it's a lot of hard stuff, I guess. But for lack of a better term, they're needing to do possibly Kegels, and a lot of females get frequent urination during night because their pelvic floor is just simply not healthy. It's not strong. It's not functional. And so doing Kegels and pelvic floor exercises, and to be honest, many men who don't know how to diaphragmically breathe, which again is most bodybuilders, have a weak pelvic floor, and doing Kegels, like flexing your junk and taint down there, like that's going to be sufficient to probably maintaining less of a need to urinate at night. The other thing, which is big for me too, and this is something that I'm guilty of at points, is there is such thing as bladder irritants, and part of that is caffeine. So if you're an individual that likes to take very high doses of caffeine, maybe closer to that bedtime window, which I already highly suggest you do not do, but that will enhance your urination rates. And then carbonated beverages, even without caffeine, that carbonation will improve, if you want to call it an improvement. They'll just make you piss more. Spicy foods is another one, anything with like peppers or any sort of hard spice. So, as a bodybuilder, we like to use sriracha, hot sauce, other things like that. That can also cause more urination. So those are things to consider. Edema in general can cause urination. So if you're not, again, as we're coming back to this, taking something like an ARB, you probably should be, as if it's obviously needed, right? But that could be part of the reason too, is that, the angiotensin is too high, thus causing a bit of retention of water, thus causing the body to stimulate release during the night. So that's kind of my big thing. And let's say it is DHT driven, I would probably start, because a lot of people would say like go to Proscar or some other kind of 5-alpha reductase inhibitor to ideally shrink the prostate. But again, I don't like the neural cognitive benefits or detriments of it, so much so to say that it's worth it. So I would actually stick with something like saw palmetto, which is a natural form, and it has been used in clinical research to show the reduction in urinary frequency during the night. And it was done in a couple of small double-blinded placebo-controlled studies, but it's a real thing. And then there's another compound that is over the counter called beta sitosterol. And this is one that not many people talk about within the bodybuilding industry, but it's highly effective in some instances, but it basically just makes it so and I don't even know, I wouldn't call it healthy, because it just makes your kidney basically retain more water. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing long-term for anybody, but those are kind of the two agents I would use if I had to. Otherwise, I would kind of do with the things Adam said, like the basics, like stop drinking water 2 hours before bed, try to refrain from caffeine 11 hours-ish before bed, high doses of it at least, so on and so forth. And you should be good. That was a good question. I think we covered that one.
This could be a peeing problem, so to speak, or rather a hydration problem, or this could be a legitimate prostate problem, and you need to investigate which one it actually is. Yeah.
Aside from tadalafil, any other fun pre-workout ingredients to use? Oh my God, there's so many. That's the beautiful part about being an enhanced bodybuilder, I think. Insulin, like great, probably one of my most favorites and the most reliable product you can use. Humalog, short-acting Humalog before a workout does wonders, for pumps. I think one thing that people are just starting to get into because of the products by Amino Asylum Stampede, and there's another one too, I can't remember what it's called, but they have ATP. Injectable ATP seems to be something that's really, I've used it, and it is very potent at causing like really painful pumps, like localized painful pumps. And then localized IGF-1 injections pre-workout are also highly effective. Those are the things I really enjoy besides Cialis. I think if I was to put it in a hierarchical chain, it would be like Cialis, insulin, probably IGF-1, and then ATP.
I've got a couple things to add to that. So one, you probably use this already, but sublingual antibody. So using 5, it depends if it's pharmaceutical or not. Let's assume it's pharmaceutical. 5 milligrams, even potentially 2.5 milligrams, especially if you're female, under the tongue to be absorbed through the capillaries and the mucus under the tongue in the mouth, are going to give it a more higher absorption rate, not go through the intestinal tract, and usually have a spike in its bioavailability. They did a bunch of studies on women's birth control, which we sort of extrapolated to this, where they actually found that the most effective is actually, through the rectum. So if you want, you can stick the animal on your butt. But let's say you don't want to stick the animal on your butt. Under the tongue is your next best bet. And taking this, prior to a workout, again, can help with force production. I don't know if it necessarily helps with pumps, but I do find anecdotally that I get better pumps. Using it could be just the higher rate of exertion or a higher ability to produce force, which causes that. And then some more vanilla, but more overlooked pre-workouts that I think many people don't utilize is legitimately just electrolyte powders. And what I mean by that is adequate sodium, magnesium, potassium intake. So prior to our workout, in my intro workout drink, I like to put a calcium, magnesium, potassium electrolyte little mixture, which helps me with muscle retention, contractions, pumps throughout the gym. Yes, definitely salt your food, and that can usually be adequate. But if you're in a very hot environment, like Texas, like many states in the US, like Thailand, adequate electrolytes can actually make a huge difference, I find, in my pumps. So sublingual anavar, insulin, IGF-1, injectable ATP. Look, you can use more potent orals, but I don't think they are worth the health cost. Anabol, Superdrol, all those things. Yeah, you'll probably get a great pump, but your blood pressure will go through. You'll probably feel like shit, and you'll probably get more severe side effects. Where I'm not going to say Anabol is completely benign, but you should have minimal to no side effects at that conservative dose. So that is usually, so usually, you combine your insulin, you combine your sublingual anavar, you have an electrolyte powder mix with maybe some liquid carbohydrates like pomegranate juice with highly cyclic branch dextrin, and that with your pre-workout meal, and man, you should have more than enough pumps and fullness going to the gym.
100%. And you talking about it got me even thinking deeper into it. So even something I don't even think we mentioned it, L-carnitine is a pretty functional pre-workout. I found that it immediately gives me a pretty strong endurance increase and a little bit of a better partitioning of lactic acid, so I don't feel as much of the burn, limiting my potential as possible. And then I think the one thing I've tried that I actually pretty thoroughly enjoyed was sublingual oxytocin. And that was really interesting. It's more of a cognitive effect. There is healing benefits to using oxytocin, which is why it's applied in a lot of clinical practice, but it seems to give you like this lust for training, just like it sounds like it would. That makes it kind of fun. Like you get kind of intimate with training, not like weird shit, but like you develop like this almost driven passion towards like beating the shit out of yourself, and that can be entertaining at times. Pedro Palomino, this is his cruise protocol: 180 milligrams of testosterone, 128 milligrams of Mastron, 4 IUs of HGH, split AM PM, and then 300 milligrams of injectable L-carnitine. This is, I mean, it's depending on your body weight, this is pretty functional, I would say.
I'd say too.
Yeah. I would be curious to see how your estrogen was on that ratio of Mastron to testosterone, just because I think people tend to forget estrogen in and of itself is an anabolic hormone. So, I have a lot of guys who run Mastron pretty high, and ultimately they crash their estrogen pretty rapidly. So if you produce enough estrogen with that low testosterone and you have that much Mastron in it, it seems to be fine, and that's great. I would also say, considering again your weight, this would be a little bit much for me. 3 milligrams per kilogram is about the top end of what I would do for a TRT or a cruise phase. But what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, a couple things basically to add to that is, firstly, what is your level of aromatization like? Do you aromatize a lot? Because correct, on a dosage like that, some individuals could even crash their estradiol or be in an unhealthy or unfavorable range. Or some individuals who seem to aromatize hard, that might keep them in check. But then my question is, why are you aromatizing to push your estradiol above the reference range on 180 milligrams of testosterone? Are you doing daily subcutaneous injections? Are you doing one shot a week? Maybe that's something you need to switch to. So personally, I would prefer to cruise somewhere on just testosterone around 125 to 150 milligrams, depending on your size. Now, I'm going to take a wild leap here and say you're not a 280-pound bodybuilder shredded and make that assumption. So you could probably get away with 125 to 150 milligrams of testosterone. Like, why do you want to add the Mastron? Like, it's not going to give you, I think, any more tissue retentive properties than just 150 milligrams of testosterone. Maybe cause issues with your estradiol with that. So potentially look to swapping to daily subcutaneous injections, because most individuals sometimes I've even found clients on low doses of testosterone like that, 180 milligrams. They're doing one shot a week. That can cause aromatization just because of that spike when they do that shot. So look at doing that. Then the other one, I actually was chatting to Kolton about this a couple of days ago, with the growth hormone split between fasted cardio and before bed. There's nothing wrong with that protocol. But if funds are limited and you're looking for more muscle retention, more recovery and growth, why not potentially put the majority of before bed or maybe even post-workout, and then simply watch your diet more and do not use the growth hormone to get lean? Because don't get me wrong, it's not incorrect to use growth hormone for fasted cardio to stay lean. It's very advantageous, very legitimate thing to do. But the question is, like, if your funds are limited, right? And let's say you can't run as much growth hormone as you want, why not use it a little bit more effectively, or rather advantageously, and use something in place of growth hormone, like, I don't know, controlling your diet, a bit of cardio, maybe even a very little bit of clenbuterol or something along those lines, depending on your health markers and your tolerance to that, to stay a bit leaner rather than using growth hormone as a very expensive fat burner, so to speak. Other than that, pretty decent protocol. Injectable carnitine. Yep. I mean, like I said, you injectable carnitine, that's going to help you stay leaner, right? So maybe pre-fasted cardio in the morning, do the injectable carnitine, do like a little bit of clenbuterol, like maybe try 20 micrograms to start, see how you react to that. Before I use a GH, you probably could use T4, maybe anywhere between 75 to 100 micrograms per day, depending on what your levels are, dependent on what your most recent blood work says. It says usually with 4IUs it's borderline where you need to be supplementing with T4 or not. Some individuals need, some don't. So you potentially look into that. But other than that, it depends on your health markers are. If you want to do a true cruise and truly try to restore health markers, consider maybe slightly dropping the testosterone, doing daily shots, and maybe dropping the masteron, depending on really how large you are and how much tissue you're trying to retain.
Yeah, I can agree with that, and I think that's really important. I think people overestimate how much muscle they might lose on a cruise. A lot of the fluid you'll be losing is mostly going to be the glycogen and water retention that was held within that glycogen from using a super physiological amount of gear. You're going to retain the groundwork that you laid of contractile tissue. It's just not going to be as apparent because you're not blasting full 24/7. And as Adam said, if your diet's in check, I've really never seen anyone look worse on cruise as long as they're still on top of their habits and so on. And I will say this, you can kind of use this sort of, I don't know what kind of graph you'd call it, but like inverse kind of line graph where you have high doses of androgens and moderate doses of peptides for your cycle. And then on your cruise, you have low doses of androgens, high doses of peptides to offset the growth linearly. So you can still see growth even on cruise using a peptide base, but you're not getting the hammering effect of androgens that's causing, lipid deterioration and renal issues and kidney issues and all that, or hepatic issues and all that. So that's kind of the other way I would look at it. So maybe dropping that masteron and using a long-acting insulin, using that HGH, using the injectable L-carnitine, but also considering other vectors of approach could be pretty handy as well. So
yeah. And I'll add one more thing about some anecdotal evidence. Paul Barnett, I think he mentioned he cruised on 125 to 150 milligrams. The dude's currently 260 lean. Yeah. Aaron from Bodybuilding with Aaron, he was saying he was cruising on, I think, 125 to 152. The dude is 120 to 130 kilograms. Myself, we can get up to 250, 260 pounds in the off season. I will do a cruise dose of 125 to 150 milligrams. You're not going to lose tissue if your diet is in check, you're training hard, especially with the growth hormone and the other, anabolics or PEDs in place. You will be fine. So I would consider dropping that again to promote, better health markers or improvement of said health markers.
Yeah, that's 100% right. People are really appreciating that we're here. I appreciate y'all. Blake King, is elevated E2 on blood work a concern even if you have no symptoms because you are using something like masteron? So I will say, what we know about elevated estrogen is that it's particularly good females on average live longer than men, and the most concluded hypothesis is that it's because they have higher levels of estrogen. But then when they hit menopause, you can see their life expectancies sharply decline super duper fast. And the risk for cardiovascular disease exceeds that of men, which is fairly interesting. And again, the hypothesis is that men sustain a decent amount of estrogen while women completely lose its production as they begin to age. So it is one of those important things that can be beneficial, especially if you're not getting side effects. It's also, you know, an antioxidant and a free radical scavenger, so you're not going to lose as much hair look, you're not going to get as much skin issues, etc. The only issue that I have with it is it can cause or is associated with patients with heart failure. And there's not a correlation as to why, but patients with heart failure have very, very high serum estrogen levels, like 300 picogram per milliliter plus. So I don't imagine people being that high, but if you are that high, that's where I'd be like, all right, even though I feel fine, I'm probably going to want to take some action to liberate a little bit more of this to get it down to somewhere within range. But if you feel fine, you're not having any nipple sensitivity, excessive emotional states. If this is one thing that's important for men to understand, if estrogen is too high or too low, erection quality can change. And erection quality doesn't mean am I getting a boner or am I not getting a boner. It's like, is my boner hard? Is it like 80% hard, 70% hard? And if it's not like 100% hard and your E2 is a little bit high, I would suggest maybe pulling back to see if that, you know, erection kit will be, because real talk, if you're not using it, you're losing it. And if your erection's not getting full and hard every time, it's only getting like 70% hard, you're losing some of that tissue, just like you would with the muscle. So
yeah. And to add to that, I mean, we need a slightly bit more context here, because you said is elevated E2. Now, how elevated are we talking? Are we talking 10% above the reference range, or are we talking quadruple the reference range? Because to add to what Kolton's saying, generally, if it is elevated and you're experiencing those side effects, that's fine. But I would want to caveat that by saying, typically, I guess we discussed this a while ago with our athletes, we don't like to go massively above the reference range, where typically, like I would say, I'm a bit more conservative because I have concerns for gynecomastia with myself and clients, where I would probably only go, let's say, 10 to 20% above the reference range usually. Now, I know some people like to do ratios of testosterone to estrogen. We don't necessarily do that. Not that we disagree with that, but that's something that we find that, let's say you do have your estradiol like triple the reference range, and let's say you are on low androgens, you may feel fine for a period of time, but all of a sudden you may get nipple sensitivity and then formation of fibrous tissue underneath your nipple pretty quickly, given how high your estradiol is. So it's one of those things where, yes, you may not be having symptoms, but given how high it is, you may have rapid development of, you know, side effects like gynecomastia, where if it's 10 to 20% above the reference range and you start feeling a little bit of nipple sensitivity, it's less likely that the symptoms will be more rapidly developed. So that's something to bear in mind too, where, yeah, if you are above the reference range, consider how high above the reference range, because if you do have the onset of side effects, it may be more severe and more rapid if you are, let's say, 4 times the reference range. So I would typically not be conservatively elevated, but then keep in mind what level is elevated, and blood work is going to be able to tell you that. And one thing I will add, try get an LCMS estradiol test, simply because if you are running an aromatase inhibitor or some other compounds that can be detected on those tests and give you skewed readings, where I've had clients going for non-LCMS testing, they come back and their estradiol was like 4 times the reference range. They freak out, even though they're not really feeling anything. We go get an LCMS test, light mass spectrometry, I think which stands for, and then basically it's within the reference range where it's slightly elevated. So also keep that in mind when you're doing your blood work and checking sex hormones like estradiol.
Yeah, that's nailed. This one's kind of relative to you, Adam. Any ideas on how to get a better mind muscle connection / pump with specific muscles? I have trouble getting a good mind muscle connection with my biceps without drop sets. Adam, you just tried a recent experiment with L-carnitine. So
okay, so firstly, I want to say I need to give credit to Dr. Todd Lee, because this was his idea and this is what he told me. And I think there are positives and negatives to this. So he advocated for pre-workout, injecting, I was trying to basically hit more of my outer quad sweep. So injected L-carnitine pre-workout into that muscle. Now, did it work and give me a better mind-muscle connection? Yes. And this may be specific to the carnitine I was injecting, but was it painful as fuck? Yes. So much so that after trying it 3-4 times, I was like, fuck it. I'll just fucking, I'll just think more about my outer sweeps with my quads to get to work. And to be honest, the bicep sounds like an even more painful area. So to answer your question in a good way, so you trouble getting good mind muscle connections with your biceps without drop sets. Okay. So firstly, I would say this almost always comes down to a technique issue, where, you know, what are you doing? What sort of loads are you doing in the gym? Are you, you know, I'm not saying you're doing this necessarily, but like, you know, are you getting, you know, super high weight, swinging it around and being like, oh, I'm not feeling my biceps. So this, I would say, we come back to a technique issue. You know, slow the eccentric of the bicep, squeeze at the peak contraction, do a moderate load where you can do anywhere from, like, I'm not even gonna say 12 reps, 15 to 25 reps. And also, there's nothing wrong with using intensity modifiers almost all the time or a lot with accessory movements like arms, biceps, triceps, and so forth. With myself, I'm a huge fan of myo reps. I'm not going to do a whole explanation of myo reps. Google myo reps. Maybe Renaissance Periodization has great videos on it, or even the creator of myo reps. But use intensity techniques like myo reps all the time to get a bit of mind muscle connection and pump are absolutely fine. But I will say, if you can't get a pump or good connection with a straight set, then it's usually a technique issue. So look at improving your technique there. If you're talking about, you say muscle connection / pump, kind of two different things there, right? Because you should still be able to get a pump from a straight set. You should be able to get a good mind muscle connection from a straight set. Will you get a better pump with a myo rep or drop set? Arguably, yes. Will you get potentially a better mind muscle connection because you have a greater pump with a myo rep set or drop set? Yes. So that is sort of to be expected. If you can't get any sort of good connection with a straight set, then, like I said, it's potentially a technique, load, or a combination of those issues.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too, there's another aspect to the whole training side of things. Like tempo, I think, is such a overlooked thing. And if you can, especially with biceps, like doing an elevated bicep curl where your elbows are up higher, you can really feel that shortened contraction, or something like a preacher curl where you actually stand opposite to where the preacher curl would normally have you do. So maybe you're like normally leaning on it like this, where your arms are at a 45-degree angle. I would recommend going to the other side where your arms dangle off a bit sharper. And really in those movements, like focus on pulling back and squeezing super fucking hard here and truly get a full contraction. Because I don't think people do that most often, is they just kind of like, and it's like squeeze that shit. Even just putting my elbow up and squeezing fucking excruciates my bicep. So you should be able to enhance your mind muscle connection by using shortened ranges of motion. So what I would do is look up bicep movements that train the shortened range and use those to cue the bicep, and then move into lengthened resistant profile movements after that. I think that's really effective. But the tempo, like holding that contraction and then a slow eccentric, holding that contraction, super duper important. I would say if it wasn't the biceps, I would say localized injection of gear is always pretty effective. It's one of those things that works really well if you know what you're doing and you're injecting appropriate amounts of it, not just like 6-7 IUs or mLs of this shit or whatever. But I think that's really the only thing you need to be worried about. If you're not getting a pump, the other thing that's plausible is maybe you're overtraining your arms. So I've never really, this is tough because, like, I guess it's possible to overtrain, but I've never really seen anyone overtrain arms like that, especially biceps. Like biceps are such a rigid muscle that it'll be really fucking hard to overtrain them. But it's possible, right? Maybe you're the one and only. And what I would suggest then is maybe take a couple, like a week, 2 weeks off of biceps, go train it again and see if the same problem is happening. And if it is, then maybe it's not overtraining and it's in fact something else. But I would start with working on kind of what both myself and Adam said, working on tempo, working on form. And I would sincerely look at like there's so many different YouTube channels that have exercise libraries, and just look up all sorts of different bicep movements, but look up high oriented bicep movements like high curls or something like that, so you can really get that bicep short and like elevate so that the shoulder portion of your bicep is short, and you'll find that that contraction is a lot easier to make. And then subsequently moving into a workout where it's training the lengthened portion is probably going to be advantageous for you. So that's a long drawn out way to say.
I agree. I'll just quickly add to that, like you talked about the shorter range, and for the lengthened range, try something like Google Bayesian curl, or behind cable curls, where basically you have your bicep. I don't know if you're able to see this, but you have your bicep behind you using a cable, and it's basically there's a lot of tension in the lengthened or stretched position, and holding it there with slow eccentric. So you have a slight pause at the bottom, maybe a second, half a second, bring it all the way up and squeezing really hard. Like shit, if you're doing that, then you're not getting a good pump, then as Kolton said, you probably need to deload. And take it. There's many ways to deload. We're not going to get into all the different ways of deloading, but take a deload and then come back fresh and try it again. Because either you're super glycogen depleted, like maybe in a severe deficit and you're calorically restricted, or potentially you need a deload. There's many aspects to this, but it may be one of these.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Keith asks, mast and test 300 milligrams mast, 200 milligrams test per week. I'm assuming this is just our idea of, is this a good cycle or not? I think that's to be honest, man, like anything close to a 1-to-1 ratio masteron test, I usually find ends up obliterating people's estrogen. So going much higher than that, so you're doing 200 milligrams of testosterone, 300 milligrams of masteron, I imagine that estrogen is going to be a big problem, especially with such a lower dose of testosterone. Like if you had maybe a higher proportionate dose of testosterone, like you're doing 600 milligrams and 700 milligrams of mast, then maybe things would be different. But with such a low, sort of almost close to physiological dose of testosterone per week with a much higher dose of masteron, I think you could run into some issues with estrogen.
Yeah. So to add what Kolton says, like it's always difficult to say, is this good without any more context?
Yeah.
Like, Keith, for instance, like what is your cycle experience? Where are you? Are you going to titrate this dose up? Have you titrated to this dose? Are you in a surplus or deficit phase? What are your goals? So let's assume you're in a surplus phase. Let's say you are 200 pounds. Let's say you have experience with anabolics before. Yeah, this is a good dose, but like you might need to titrate more than this depending on how large you are. Or maybe this is a pretty hectic dose if you've never used gear before and you're jumping straight on this. Because if you've never used anabolics before, I'd be like, no, actually, I don't think this is a good cycle. I agree with Kolton that on face value, for somewhat experienced or intermediate lifters who are experienced with antibiotics, yeah, this is great. This is something that's moderate. It's not super high, but it's contextual, right? It really depends where you are, what your goals are, what your health markers are, how much you aromatize. And even the cycle, are you doing one injection a week? Because this might not be enough masteron to control that if you're not doing, frequent injections. So, it's not like we're trying not to answer your question and give you a straight answer. It's simply that you usually need to get more context, because most of these answers are going to be, it depends, really.
Yeah, I agree. Brandon asks an interesting question. Is there any situation that you would deploy Dianabol into a cycle or a client / yourself? So I'm gonna be honest, I would never, unless there's one instance I can think of, which is like I'm training a strong man and we're just simply trying to the night before the show, he figures out what lifts he's doing, because they don't really know until the couple days before the competition. And maybe it's like not endurance based at all. It's all like strength based. So, okay, we need to get body weight up super fast. So like pop a ton of fucking Dianabol and eat like 6 packs of ramen noodles and like go rock some shit. But that's like the only case. Like there's almost no use cases in which I would use Dianabol in a cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much covered it. There are so many better compounds to use. Like I would argue, like, what are you trying to achieve here? If you're trying to spark up your blood pressure and have a lot of water retention or aromatization, yeah, it'd be great. But most people don't want that. So there's so many better compounds to use, mostly injectable. If you want to use an oral, look at things like Turinabol. Look at things like oral Anabol. I'm not really going to say Winstrol because I think it's best used in a pre-contest scenario. I don't think it's good in the off-season or even during a deficit phase. Those are really the only two orals I would use. And to be honest, most of the time it's going to be Anavar. So, yeah, to answer your question, no, I wouldn't. And even with Kolton, even with that strongman, right? Would you potentially look at using something like a Superdrol or an Anadrol over the
like if this guy had like his box of pharmaceuticals and like all he had was D-ball left at the bottom of the till, dust on it, like okay, we're gonna leverage that. But if he's methodical, planned out, likely he has a lot of other assets on hand that we'd rather play.
Is there a situation? Yes, you're a strong man. You have no gear. You're trying to win your pro card, and
the guy at 11 is selling D-ball.
Yeah, that's all you fucking have. That's all you have.
Just fucking taking whatever. Is there a certain number you want estrogen to be? So I think it's in picograms in America. What is it different for you?
Yes. So I get I have to switch between the two.
Go ahead.
But
I mean, for me, it's like 20 picograms per milliliter to 60 for men using androgens around there. For men not using androgens, I would say 10 to 40 picograms per milliliter. I don't know what your numbers are looking like in Australia or your opinion.
Yeah, so we do picomoles per liter, and usually the reference range that you're looking for is basically 40 to 150 for estradiol. And sort of based on what we touched on previously, there's no specific certain number, but to give you an idea, whatever the reference range is, whether it be US, Australia, UK, whatever, we would generally recommend 10 to 20% above the reference range. But even that recommendation can be circumstantial. So like, I don't know, let's say you're a high level competitor and you're running, a shitload of androgens, you've already pushed testosterone up. More than 20% above the reference range, if you're not getting side effects, may be, applicable because for you to get, within the reference range, maybe you need to take, a shitload of aramacin, which is usually not advisable. But to be honest, even if you're running a shitload of testosterone, usually you can get it to within 20% of the reference range, roughly there, without having to use a shitload of AI. So yeah, to answer your question, generally 10 to 20% above the reference range or in the reference range is advisable, but it is not always the case, but most of the time it is.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Casey. The question, should you cycle off of T4, and if so, how? Personally, I don't think you need to. I think it's pretty innocuous. You take it out, your body starts generating its own again pretty much within the next 12 hours. So yeah, it's and if you are having issues, look at your iodine intake, look at your selenium intake, and you should be just fine. It's really, thyroid is thankfully one of those, I should say, the precursor to thyroid hormone is one of those things you can really hammer and not have a long-term prolonged effect from it. If you are abusing T3, the active form of thyroid, that can cause some issues, but you're generally going to be okay using T4. Do you guys recommend carb cycling diet approach, or is that better reserved for heavier athletes utilizing insulin? You go ahead and take this one away. We're going to have similar opinions here.
Yeah, so I think everyone should do carb sampling. Your grandma, your kid, your baby.
Fucking dog.
I think there are different degrees to carbohydrate cycling, and I think usually it's applicable to both. So let me start off on the general lifestyle individual who's not necessarily a bodybuilder. What carbohydrate cycling approach I like to use is almost a calorie cycling approach, where I don't necessarily have high days or refeed days, but I have rest day, low days, so to speak, or medium days and training days. Now, ideally, I would like them to hit the exact macronutrient numbers and cycle their carbohydrates, having lower carbohydrates on their rest days and higher carbohydrates on their training days. But to be honest, most of the time, I'm just trying to get these clients to adhere. So most of the time, it becomes calorie cycling. I tell them, just hit your calories, just hit your protein. But even calorie cycling, when carbs and fats are a little bit all over the place, still is beneficial with keeping them insulin sensitive, keep limiting their adipose tissue, fueling training and performance, and fueling recovery when they need those carbohydrates. And for almost all individuals who are athletes, whether they are, unless you're like an endurance runner, which might be, but let's say strength and hypertrophy athletes, I would almost always advocate to do a carb cycling approach. I've done many different diets, researched many different methodologies, used them on myself and clients, and usually always come back to carbohydrate cycling is the most effective for recovery and performance. And yeah, to add to that, the usage of insulin can enhance it, but it's not necessarily at all. The principles behind it, that you're basically biasing your carbohydrate intake on training days for performance and recovery, and pulling back on rest days to be more insulin sensitive, to basically bias those training days, is universally applied whether you're on insulin or not. One last thing. So the idea behind it, like let's say we are eating 3,000 calories, the average calories we're trying to consume, and the carbohydrate amount is 300 carbs, just for ease of numbers. And let's say you're eating 300 carbs every day. So one athlete's doing that, and then another athlete is doing a carbohydrate cycling approach, where maybe they're pushing their carbohydrates down to 150, somewhere around there on their rest days, and then pushing up their carbohydrates to 450 on their train days, or 400. And that roughly averages out to 3,000 calories and 300 carbohydrates, like the athlete eating the same amount every day, right? Sure, the athlete eating the same amount every day might be slightly better at controlling hunger because they've got slightly higher food on their rest days. But the athlete with the higher carbohydrate intake can have a shitload more pre-workout and post-workout carbs, which is going to affect performance, fuel performance, and it's going to affect recovery. So arguably, over time, the athlete doing the carbohydrate cycling approach is going to have better training, better recovery, which I would argue long-term is going to lead to more muscle growth. Even though they're eating the same calories and carbohydrates amounts, it's how they've utilized it and how they've implemented the timing of said carbohydrates. And I could go forever about this, but Kolton, you jump in.
Yeah, I agree. Adam has everything to say right there. It's in general, one thing I think that's just an important add-on to what Adam said is that you have to consider glycogen replenishment. It depends on carbohydrates, but also total caloric intake. So let's say you're consuming carbohydrates, but you're not consuming enough calories. You would ultimately just oxidize those carbohydrates right away. So it also depends on total calorie intake. So in general, what you're talking about when you're talking about carb cycling, and it's just something that people label as something, is just calorie cycling. Like you're ultimately just increasing systemic calories by a small margin, using primarily carbohydrate, maybe lowering fat intake to allow for an excess of carbohydrate. But in total, the net effect is an increase in calories. So it's effective. And in general, the way you want to think about it is, how can I localize, in a sense, my recovery and adaptation to exercise, whilst also improving my metabolic and insulin partitioning effects, right? And that's kind of the fix to the solution, is using this cycling approach. There is one other variation of this, which is fat cycling. And I do use this for some of my clients who have a really, really hard time with carbohydrates. I have one client in particular named Java, who is this exact individual. He can have, 300 grams of carbohydrates, and he's a big dude, and it just blows him up. Like literally the dude he turns into a fucking bloat lord. So in his situation, we actually use a different treatment, which would be using high fat cycling as opposed to high carbohydrate intake. And that works really great for him. And this is where it's, all about the milieu and what you can tolerate, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think Kolton hit the hammer on the head there. That yes, I gave general statements about that, but there are specific individuals who can respond differently, and it could be genetics, it could be even like ethnicity and heritage, and many factors that play into that. And that's where it comes to, learning about your own body, seeing how you react, or getting assistance from, an educated or informed individual to assist you with that, to learn and navigate these things.
Yeah, 100%. So we have one more, and then we'll wrap it up. Flynn Rider, test and mass sounds like a great cycle, but is dutasteride and RU588 for one enough to stop hair loss on mast? I know it is only I know it is on test only for me, but mast scares me. So yeah, RU will absolutely help, because it's literally just holding that androgen receptor hostage so nothing can bind to it. Dutasteride is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, so it's not actually inhibiting, for example, mastron attaching to that receptor and causing follicle miniaturization. It's just simply stopping testosterone from creating more DHT. So RU would certainly be effective. Dutasteride might actually proliferate the issue worse, because now you're not metabolizing the mastron, and it has all the efficacy to attach to receptors in your scalp and cause miniaturization. The other difficult sort of hard to theorize thing here is that a lot of people have preached, specifically Victor Black, is that the mastron is not a bioidentical form of DHT, and therefore it can't affect the hair follicle is miniaturization in a sense, as your testosterone being cleaved into DHT. So hypothetically, mastron should be hair safe because it's not DHT. It's just a derivative of DHT. Just as tren is not a 19-nor variant of testosterone. It is tren, but it's a derivative of 19-nor testosterone. So in a sense, like, mastron shouldn't cause hair loss, but it's not what we see in practical evidence. So I would say RU is great. I would say that for me and Adam, primobolan caused much more hair loss than any compound under the sun. So I think mastron is probably the safer bet for the majority of people.
Yep. So sort of to add to what Kolton was saying, a couple of things here. So with dutasteride, and again, I have to credit Dr. Todd for this, you can actually get a topical form of dutasteride. So similar to the topical RU5841, you can get topical dutasteride and use that on your scalp. And that's something I actually use myself. So you can get topical dutasteride and finasteride to help assist with that, which again, has different pathways from the oral form, which may stop basically the DHT getting to the hair follicles themselves. In addition to that, you can look into minoxidil, which won't necessarily stop hair loss, but potentially cause a bit of hair regrowth. Which may be something to add to your, I guess, hair loss stack, so to speak. So maybe some RU5841, some topical dutasteride. I would prefer that over finasteride simply because most of the clinical evidence shows that it's slightly more effective. And then add some minoxidil as well, basically. And you can add like, needling to your scalp, where you either use a machine or a roller. That can also promote hair growth. And then going to the primobolan, mastron, and the anecdotal evidence that we've experienced and also with clients, can't give you a reason, but for whatever reason, primobolan seems to cause almost everyone I speak to. So again, take this with a bucket of salt. I'm not saying this is scientific evidence here, but anecdotally, everyone we speak to, primobolan seems to be like top of the list for hair loss, with tren, with some individuals being quite high as well. And mastron, surprisingly, with not everyone, but many individuals, including myself, can run, pretty high doses of it and not experience it. Like, I never really experienced any hair loss until I used primobolan, and it happened literally almost overnight, where, had a fair bit of experience with mastron. As soon as I introduced primobolan, start going bald. Yeah. So take that in consideration with yourself. And if you're cognizant of your hair, and you because most people don't really worry about hair loss until they've lost the hair. So if you already are cognizant of it, and you checking, if you're losing shitloads of hair in the showers or on your bed pillow, you don't see any of that, and you're following this protocol and using a bit of mastron, you should be fine.
Yeah. I will say, to add to this, topical metformin seems to be really effective. And topical, you just mentioned it, the form of Accutane that's topical, tretinoin, seem to be effective at stimulating hair follicle retention and growth. So, and there's I'm forgetting their name. I always forget it. I post on my Instagram. If you go there, it's literally in my highlights. But there's a company. It's in my Q&A highlights. There's a company that produces a product that's literally all in one. I literally have no discount code with them or anything, but they produce one vial that has everything: metformin,
you mentioned
finasteride, all the fucking shit in there. That's dope. So
that's awesome.
But guys, it is late here. It's early in the morning for him, so he's got to go train and I got to go to bed. That's how this shit works. If any of y'all have any more questions, be sure to hit us up on Instagram. You can just simply follow me at Kolton_red, and then the Sarms Goblin Manager, aka Adam, is just going to be Hyperdrive Hypertrophy on Instagram. you can find him there. We obviously coach together. We work through this thing together. So if you need help, if you need a coach, you know where to find us. That's it. So very simple. Appreciate everyone being here. Thank you and have a good night.
Awesome. Cheers, guys. Appreciate it.